Good morning. How many of you have ever gone to a restaurant and noticed the people at the tables around you? Maybe it's just me, but whenever I go out to eat, I tend to do a quick look around at what's going on all around me before I sit down at the table. And I've started to notice a couple different trends that we're going to act out this morning. So the first trend I notice when I go into a restaurant is I might see a bunch of people at the table, and they're all having a good time. They're laughing, they're smiling, they're having a blast. This is the party that you want to be at, right? And sometimes these groups have 5 people, sometimes they have 4 people, sometimes they have 7 or 12 people, and they take up the whole restaurant, and they're dragging tables together and chairs together. But every time I see one of those groups, I want to be a part of them. They always look like a ton of fun, and I always feel just a little bit left out. So that's the first group I've noticed. The second group I notice when I go to a restaurant is a couple. It's a one-on-one. Maybe it's a date. Maybe it's 2 friends catching up. And this group is just as fun as the other one, I think, but oftentimes in a different way. It's not loud. It's not flashy. But the conversation is deep, it's close. There's a different connection that's going on. You know, I love when Megan and I get to have these moments. Because normally we talk about bills, or we talk about what's going on, who went to the grocery store, what we're making for dinner. We're talking about who's going to fold that load of laundry. But when we have these moments, we talk about our hopes and our dreams. We talk about the things that are going well, the things that are hard. We get to connect. I love both of these scenarios. But then there's a third scenario I've started to notice more and more at restaurants. Maybe you've picked up on this one too. And you walk by the table, and everyone's got their own device. And you wonder, is there a conversation happening? Is there any connection going on? You know, when I see this, I hope that they're texting each other, honestly. But I don't think they are. I noticed that I started to become a table device user a couple years ago when I worked at a grocery store. And what would happen at this grocery store is they would send 10 people on a break at the same time, but none of us knew each other. And so we'd go up to the break room, we'd microwave our frozen dinner, and we'd pull out our iPhone or our headphones, and we would start scrolling. And for 30 minutes, we would sit around a table just like this and never talk to someone. In all 3 of our scenarios, thank you for helping us out. In all 3 of our scenarios, there's people, there's food, and there's a table. In those first 2 scenarios, the table served as a centerpiece or an anchor for the community and for connection. In our third scenario, though, the table served as an iPad stand. And so I say all that this morning. I give us this illustration. We have this table up here to lead us into the series we're going into. We're jumping today into a brand new series called The Table. And it's all about the meals that Jesus had with people. If you've read the Gospels, you notice that Jesus does a lot of eating around a lot of tables with a lot of people. That's a regular practice that Jesus is doing. And so we thought, in an age of air fryers and iPads and microwavable dinners and an age of TV trays, what would it look like for us to learn from Jesus about the way that he modeled eating with people? And so we're going to jump in today with the story of a man named Zacchaeus. If you have your Bible, you can turn to Luke chapter 19. We're going to be reading verses 1 through 10. And this is really going to be our launch and our intro point into this entire series. We're going to see Jesus interact with a man around a table and what transpires because of that. So again, we're going to be in Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. I'll read the whole thing for us, and then we'll jump in. Then Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. So he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. But when they saw it, they all complained, saying, he is gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner. Then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. One of the really challenging parts of the story for us is that if you've grown up around the church, you've probably heard of Zacchaeus and you only know of him as a wee little man. Right? When I think of Zacchaeus, all I know about is that song. All I remember about is that song. And then I started digging into the story of Zacchaeus, and I realized the text doesn't tell us much more about him. It's a really short piece of scripture. We don't get a lot of information about Zacchaeus. And so when we're going to write a song about him, all we're left with is knowing that he is a wee little man. We can skim across this story in about 30 seconds and move on. But what we do is we miss a lot of the depth that's going on. We miss a lot of the pieces that are actually making the story vibrant and beautiful. And so today that's what we're going to do. We're going to jump in, we're going to dig deep, move from just knowing Zacchaeus as a wee little man to knowing a lot more about him and what this interaction would have been like for him. And so in verse 1, we're introduced to the story with Jesus walking into Jericho. And this journey that Jesus is on would have been his final journey. He started up north in a town called Capernaum, and he's come down now and he's entering into Jerusalem. And on his way into Jerusalem, he ends up in Jericho. Interestingly, you can see the journey Jesus took on this map. Normally, you would walk straight south. You can see he started in Capernaum. He hits this area called Gennesaret, and you can read about this in Luke chapter 9. Jesus encounters some really tough opposition. He encounters so much opposition, in fact, that instead of taking the normal path, there would be a path kind of straight down through Samaria. Instead of taking that normal path, he's going to go and take the back roads. And the back roads are going to lead him through Jericho. So the fact that Jesus is even in Jericho right now, about to meet this man named Zacchaeus, is kind of unexpected or unplanned for him. And yet all along this journey, as Jesus is going from town after town in these areas that aren't common, he's encountering people, he's offering healing, he's teaching. God is still working and using him. And so even though Jericho wasn't the expected place that Jesus would have been, he ends up there, and he's ready to do whatever the Father has for him. And so while Jericho, while not the original plan, would have been a really awesome city to stop by. As you can see, Jericho is about 15 or 20 miles from Jerusalem, so he's got maybe another day or two on this journey as he heads into Jerusalem. And Jericho was known as the city of palm trees because of the beautiful trees that were all around the town. Jericho was a much smaller city than Jerusalem. It was near beautiful scenery like these trees. It was also a lot closer to rivers and the Dead Sea. So it was a great vacation spot if you wanted to go there. Jericho was known as an oasis city for those who were rich, that wanted to get out of the politics of Jerusalem, that wanted to get out of the crowds of Jerusalem, and that also wanted to get out of the poor and the homeless areas of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had a lot of poor and homeless people. Jericho didn't have very many. So if you were rich and you were tired of seeing poor people walking down the street, you could just move to Jericho and not have to see that anymore. And we have record that leaders and rulers and people of power in this time would have these retreats and these oases, these vacations in Jericho as a chance to get away. And so this is the context that Jesus is entering into as he moves into Jericho. He knows that he's heading towards Jerusalem. He's entering this town that's full of rich and wealthy people. That's a great place to be. And as he enters Jericho now, the town begins to erupt in a frenzy. By this point, Jesus would have been well known, and his travel path was known as well. And there are stories from the last couple of years of the things that he's taught, the people he's healed, the way that he's done these miraculous signs. And so people want to see Jesus. And it's in this frenzy of activity, in this chaos that's ensuing, that we meet a man named Zacchaeus. And he's described in the text as a man who's a tax collector and a man who is rich. Now, in this time period, tax collecting wasn't like taxes now. This wasn't a man who worked for the IRS. This wasn't someone who you sent your taxes to and they told you how much you owed or whatever. Tax collecting was a way different profession. In fact, tax collecting was seen as a low profession, a dirty profession. If you were a tax collector, your job was to get the set amount of taxes that were due to Rome, but you also were allowed to charge above and beyond that, however much you wanted, and you were able to keep that. And so Zacchaeus would spend his days going around charging people taxes, and we know that he charged above and beyond because the text said that he's rich. So Zacchaeus is a man who is living his life, stealing from the people all around him, taking advantage of anyone he comes into contact, and is just using people. We also see, interestingly, they describe Zacchaeus as the chief tax collector. And this is really fascinating to me because this is the only time in Scripture we see this phrasing used. And so we don't entirely know what a chief tax collector would have been. So some wonderings about that are maybe he's responsible for other tax collectors. He's a sort of tax collector manager. Other ideas are that maybe he was sent to Jericho, a place that's wealthier, because he was really good at his job. Some other ideas might be maybe he was given some larger areas to be a tax collector at. Whatever it is, we can infer that Zacchaeus was really good at his job, good enough to get a promotion, and he's really good at stealing from people, because it says he's rich. And so Zacchaeus lives this extravagant, this lavish, this wealthy lifestyle. But we assume that he experiences loneliness and isolation. Right? It's hard to have friends when you work for the enemy. It's hard to have friends when your job is to steal from everyone you talk to. Tax collecting probably gave him, or in fact we know it gave him, a big payout. But it probably took all of his reputation too. And that's Zacchaeus' life. He's alone. He doesn't have a community. He doesn't have people he can go to the restaurant with and hang out. Zacchaeus is hated by everyone in Jericho. He's seen as a sellout in his faith and in his culture. And he's known as someone who has stolen from everyone. And so this man Zacchaeus, who has an extravagant, lovely lifestyle, but no community or friends, hears that Jesus is coming into town. And he, like everybody else, is intrigued. He's heard the stories. He knows who this guy is. He's heard the things he's done. He's heard his teachings. And he wants to see him too. I bet Zacchaeus has heard the stories of the way that Jesus has treated tax collectors and wonders, could it be me? I'm sure Zacchaeus has heard the stories of the people he's healed and wondered, could I see Jesus heal someone too? Zacchaeus is intrigued, so he goes with the rest of the town to the parade, but he runs into a problem. And it's not a problem we'd maybe expect, but it's a problem that exists. You see, Zacchaeus is too short. In a crowd full of people, he can't see the guy he's trying to see. I was doing some research this week. Scholars have been really intrigued about this. What does it mean that Zacchaeus was too short? And so they've actually tried to figure out how tall Zacchaeus would be, and I thought this was so fun. The average man in this time, in this culture, in this context, would have been between 5'4" and 5'6". For reference, I'm 6 foot, so like a head shorter than me would have been the average height for a man. Based on that, scholars assume Zacchaeus was probably max 5 foot tall. So if the average person's like this tall, you've got Zacchaeus is like down here. But then scholars also took it one step further. You know, it's one thing to go to a parade and you're short, but there's some options you can have, right? You can push your way through. You could ask if someone could move a little bit. You could try and jump or find a friend and see if they could lift you up. Imagine making yourself known in a parade, though, when everyone hates you. It's not going to go well for him, right? You see, Zacchaeus has learned that in order for him to live the life he wants, he's got to be as anonymous as possible. Right? In a chaos, in a frenzy, if he makes himself known, he puts his life on the line. And so Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus, but he's way too short, and he's way too much of a risk to make himself known. But lucky for Zacchaeus, he's crafty, he's inquisitive, he's smart, and he's going to figure out a different plan. He wants to see Jesus so bad that he's going to go ahead and climb up a sycamore tree. So instead of giving up, he searches for a new plan. He finds this sycamore tree, and he goes ahead and climbs up it. So this is a sycamore tree in Israel today, but they look about the same. They haven't really changed much. And there's a couple really interesting things about the sycamore tree that make this a really easy tree for Zacchaeus to climb. First, you notice that trunk is super low to the ground. So he can scale the tree really easily. These are like the prime time climbing trees. Second, it's got a lot of branches that he can maneuver around on. So Zacchaeus can get up that tree easily, and he can move to the place that he needs to be. Thirdly, though, and most important when climbing this particular sycamore tree, there's a lot of coverage and leafy leaves, I guess. There's a lot of coverage and leaves for Zacchaeus, and what that means is he can get up in that tree and he can hide and camouflage himself. You see, I think today it's probably similar. Climbing a tree is seen as like a childish thing, right? If we saw somebody in a tree after church, we'd be like, that's a little weird. And even more so, that is the context here. For Zacchaeus to be in a tree is an act of disgrace, of disrespect. It's a shameful act for himself. And so Zacchaeus, again, is just in another tough spot. He wants to see Jesus, and he's going to go as far as he can. He's going to shame himself, potentially ridicule his already small reputation, just so he can see Jesus. I imagine Zacchaeus is probably 10 to 12 feet up there, doing his best to hide. And he gets that glimpse. Jesus is walking by. And he starts to breathe really slow. He wants to savor and hold on to this moment. And Jesus walks by. And all of a sudden, Jesus looks up. And Zacchaeus thinks to himself, oh no, I've been found. I wonder in that moment what that would have been like for Zacchaeus. All his fears are becoming realized. They noticed him in the tree. What are they going to do to him next? Jesus calls to him, and he says, Zacchaeus, I must stay at your house. Wow. He didn't say, Zacchaeus, you fool. He didn't say, Zacchaeus, get out of the tree. What are you doing? He said, Zacchaeus, I must stay at your house today. Jesus could have taken notice of anyone. There was a crowd around him. There were people everywhere. But Jesus saw the guy who was searching, but who was hidden. Jesus saw the guy that was alone. Jesus saw the guy who needed him. And so Zacchaeus comes out of the tree, and they go now off to spend time together, to share a meal together, to get to know each other. And I've been thinking about this story all week of Zacchaeus coming out of the tree. And I've been struck wondering how many Zacchaeuses are there all around us? How many people are climbing a tree right in front of me or right behind me, and they're trying to figure out who Jesus is? And what do? I say, you fool, you're in a tree. Get down here. Or I walk by and I don't notice them. Or I think to myself, that's really weird, and I walk on. And I've been so convicted by the fact that Jesus saw him. He turned to look at him and he said, I must have a meal with you. I must share life with you. I must be in a relationship with you. And as we think about our friends and our family and our neighbors, our coworkers, the people all around us that are searching, maybe it's in a tree, maybe it's on Facebook, maybe it's at a bar. People all around us are searching, though. What are we doing for them? Are we saying, I must have a meal with you? Or are we saying, get out of the tree? And so Jesus and the disciples, they head into Zacchaeus' house now, and they start to have their time together. Presumably, they're eating, they're sharing, they're having a conversation. Interestingly, in Scripture, we get no explanation on what went on in the house. We don't know if Jesus talked. We don't know if Zacchaeus talked. We don't know if there was laughter and crying or silence or jokes. We have no clue. But they begin to have life together. And while this is going on, we do get a picture of what's going on outside of the house. You see, there's another group of people, the same people who've been following Jesus around all day, the people who aren't with him in this meal right now. And they're outside the house. They're presumably able to hear some of what's going on or see some of the activity, and they start to complain. They complain because Jesus is spending time in the home of a sinner. I find it fascinating that we don't see or hear or know about what went on inside the home, but we do know what went on outside the home. Right? We don't get to hear about the awesome conversation. We just get to hear about the complaints. And so you wonder to yourself, these people outside who are complaining, maybe they're annoyed that Jesus went into Zacchaeus' home and not their home. Like, man, I vacuumed and I cleaned and I got everything ready and he didn't show up. Maybe they're jealous. They think that their life is better than Zacchaeus. I don't steal. I honor God. I'm a good citizen. I do what I'm supposed to do. And Jesus seems to ignore me. Maybe, I've wondered about this one too, maybe they really liked Jesus until he started hanging out with the people they didn't like, and now they don't like him. Whatever it was, we don't entirely know why they're complaining. We just know they're complaining a lot. They're complaining loudly enough that the people are hearing this, and it got added into Scripture. And we start to see the disconnect unravel from the people who are outside complaining. These are the people who thought they knew Jesus, but they didn't catch what Jesus was about. These were the people that were so excited to see the teacher, but they missed that he was teaching them in the moment. For Jesus, he didn't care about the crowds or the spectacle or the noise or the activity or the excitement. He cared about the one person and the time together and the meal together and the opportunity to invest in somebody and see transformation. And so we see the end result now of Jesus' meal with Zacchaeus begin to play out at the end of this text. The meal finishes up. Zacchaeus and Jesus and the rest of the disciples, they leave the home, they go outside, and they're immediately seen by the people who are complaining. And Zacchaeus begins to share. He takes this opportunity to begin to speak. And he doesn't say, this was a really fun time, or this was a really good meal, or I loved getting to get to know Jesus a little bit. No, Zacchaeus starts to share that this moment has led to a change in his life and his heart. Zacchaeus shares that he is responding differently. He says he's going to pay back all that he's stolen from people. He's stolen a lot. He says he's going to give some of his excess to the poor. He's rich. He has a lot of excess. He says he's going to start acting with integrity in his life and in his career. A career that's built upon stealing, he's going to begin acting with integrity. At the table, Zacchaeus has an encounter that changed his life. He recognizes the lordship of Jesus Christ, and it immediately ripples out into his life. Like, imagine what Zacchaeus' life is going to become when he starts doing all these things, when he starts acting honorably, when he begins to give away some of his excess, when he begins to treat people with respect. Imagine how his life is going to change. Now, play that out to Jericho. When your tax collector begins acting with integrity, when he begins giving away some of his excess, when he begins treating people fairly, that changes towns and reputations. That one moment, that one meal, that one conversation has the opportunity to do more in Jericho than ever imagined. And Zacchaeus, the sinner, the tax collector, he was the spark. And so here, as we begin to close up our time together, here's ultimately what I'm hoping we catch from today. The table served as the launch pad for an encounter with Jesus. The table served as the thing that led to a transformation in Zacchaeus' life. The small moments and acts of conversation and hospitality and eating together did more in Zacchaeus' life than he could have imagined. And I don't think this is just unique to Jesus. I actually think this is part of the reality of what the table is. The table is a launch pad in our life. The table is a space where we're invited to lay down our assumptions, to lay down our criticisms and our judgment of others, to open up space and conversation, and for the Spirit of God to move as we're with one another. You see, I think the table is just as much of a launch pad today as it was for Zacchaeus. The table is just as much of a space for people who are searching to encounter Jesus as it was back then. Something happens with relationships when we slow down, when we share a meal together, when we have a conversation, when we drop our complaints from one another, and we listen and we share. The table is a launch pad for people to encounter the love of Jesus. And just like the story of Zacchaeus, that table can be the place where our life is changed. I'm sure a lot of us have stories about tables in our life and the work God did at them. I can think back to meals with my youth pastor, where he taught me what it looked like to follow Jesus. The table has shaped me. The table has shaped us. And so the question is, moving forward, what does that mean for our life? If we know the power of the table, what does that look like moving forward? You see, here's the invitation I think we have. The table is a place for transformation if we're willing to open up our table. And so what does it look like for you over these next couple weeks as we head into Easter, as we head into a time where we're excited about the message of Jesus and we want people to hear and to know? What does it look like for you to open up your table for your friends, for your family, for your coworkers? How can we use the things that God has given us, the space, the time in our calendar, the resources we have, to invest and to share, hoping and believing and trusting that the table isn't just two pieces of wood put together. The table is a space for the Spirit of God to open up and to move and to be unleashed. And so that's the challenge we've got for you this week. Who do you need to begin inviting to your table? Who do you need to make time with, make space with, make margin for? Who have you been praying for or asking God to do a work in their life And maybe that next step is to invite them over for dinner. Who do we, as a church, need to open up our tables for, to love and invest? Because the story of Zacchaeus, I don't believe, is a one-off. I think the story of Zacchaeus can be all of our stories. We can be people who open our tables, who open our hearts, who open our homes for the Spirit of God to be unleashed. And so as we think about that, as we process that, as we close out our sermon today, I hope that we as a church can be a place where our tables are wide open, where our hearts are wide open, and where we can see God continue to move as we're open to what he wants to do. So we're going to invite you to stand as we sing this last song and close. And let's keep our tables open.